The sirens hit at 9 p.m. like clockwork. Same hour, same scream, same cold punch in the stomach. In Hamburg, families drop whatever they're doing and rush for shelter. Kids get yanked by the sleeve. Old folks shuffle down stairwells. Somewhere outside, anti-aircraft crews crank their guns up and load shells. Night fighter pilots run for their planes, already sweating under their gear. And then, nothing. No engines, no bomb bursts, no fires, just quiet. That happens again the next night, and the next, and the next. 5 nights in a row, sirens, panic, scrambling defenses, and empty skies. By the 6th night, the city is worn down to the bone. People are tired, angry, embarrassed. Some start thinking, it's probably another false alarm. Some don't even bother getting out of bed. Some decide the shelter can wait. Then the sirens scream again at 9 p.m. This time, it's real. The Royal Air Force is coming. And before the night is over, Hamburg is burning so hard the glow can be seen from far away. Tens of thousands of lives are shattered in hours. The city becomes a furnace. Streets, rooftops, whole blocks turning into something that doesn't look like a city anymore. Here's the part that sounds impossible until you really sit with it. The next morning, American bombers show up in broad daylight. Big formations, clear as day. Hundreds of aircraft rolling over the same battered city. And people watching from the ground feel safer. Not safe, but safer than they did the night before. Think about how backwards that is. The Americans would end up dropping enormous tonnage. Their daylight raids could be brutally accurate for the time. They hit factories, shipyards, oil plants, rail targets, things that mattered, but German civilians, and even German pilots who fought both, kept saying the same basic thing. Daylight raids felt like something you could understand. Night raids felt like something you couldn't. And the fear came from that difference. If you want more WWII stories that dig into the why behind what happened, tap subscribe, because this one gets darker the deeper you go. Now, it wasn't because Germans were weak. They weren't. Germany built one of the most advanced air defense systems on Earth. Radar stations, searchlights, heavy flak batteries around major cities, dedicated night fighters with specialized gear, an entire machine designed to detect bombers, track them, and kill them. And against daylight raids, that machine could actually work. When American formations came in during the day, German controllers could often pick them up from far out. They could estimate direction, altitude, speed, likely targets. Fighters could be scrambled in time. Flak crews could brace for the bomb run. Commanders could concentrate defenses where they guessed the Uder was coming. Daylight had a weird kind of logic, but night changed the rules, and the British wrote those rules with a pen dipped in ice water. A lot of people assume the RAF flew at night, mainly because it was safer than daylight. That's only part of it. Night bombing also made the RAF hard to read, hard to predict, hard to punish. The goal wasn't just to avoid German fighters. It was to turn the sky into a place where defenders could hear danger but couldn't grab it. To make an entire country feel like the threat could come from anywhere, at any time, in any number. And that pressure wasn't an accident. It was a weapon. You can see it in how the nights felt for ordinary people. Those sirens, the sprint to shelter, the hours listening, the uncertainty. After enough of that, people weren't just scared of bombs. They were scared of the waiting. German doctors even described a kind of air raid terror that wasn't only about the explosions. It was about the anticipation, being trapped in that nightly question, is this the night? Now zoom in from the civilians to the men trying to stop the raids. Picture a German night fighter crew in 1944. They're scrambled because radar shows bombers approaching. The pilot climbs into blackness. The sky is empty but heavy, like it's pressing down. The radar operator sweeps his scope, trying to pull shapes out of nothing. Ground control is talking them in. They're near you. Then, they're above you. So the pilot climbs. Then, now they're below you. So he dives. Then, they've passed you. So he turns hard, searching, scanning, straining his eyes until they hurt. And for a split second, barely a heartbeat, he catches it. Not a bright silhouette, not a clean target. Just a darker shadow moving inside the darkness. 4 engines worth of danger, and it's already slipping away. He doesn't get a clean shot. He doesn't even get close. And a moment later, the night swallows it again. He returns to base, writes a report that basically says, "Contact made, contact lost." Then he's back up again tomorrow, and the next night, and the next. After enough of those nights, your body stops trusting sleep. Every sound feels like a threat. You start thinking crazy thoughts like, "Send me to the Eastern Front. At least there I can see what's trying to kill me." Now compare that to an American daylight raid. It's noon. Visibility is good. And there they are. American heavy bombers in big groups, tight formations you can actually track with your eyes. As a German pilot, you can see the problem coming. You can see the escort fighters. You can guess the target based on the direction. You can get your squadron up, pick an angle, choose a moment, commit to an attack. You might die doing it, but it feels like a fight. Daylight gives you something to aim at. Night gives you ghosts. That's the psychological difference people talk about, and it matters a lot. But here's where most explanations stop too early. Because the fear wasn't only emotional, it was also math. Cold, brutal math. And once you understand the numbers behind how these raids worked, you'll get why some German commanders quietly preferred dealing with the Americans, even when the American raids were bigger, louder, and hit major parts of the war economy. But to get there, you first need to understand how each side fought. The Americans built a daylight system that depended on mass. Huge formations of B-17S and B-24s, flying high, aiming for military production. Over time, they added escort fighters that could go the distance, like the P-51, which changed the game in the air. The Germans responded with a system designed to counter patterns, track the formations, predict their paths, throw fighters and flak into the same airspace, inflict enough losses to force changes. And sometimes it worked, so much that certain raids became infamous for the casualties they took. The British at night did something different. They weren't trying to present a single neat fist in the sky. They became a flowing threat, bombers spaced out over time and distance, shifting height and direction, making defenders chase shadows. Even when a German night fighter managed to find one bomber and bring it down, the clock kept moving. By the time that fighter landed, refueled, and climbed back into the dark, the main wave could be gone. So the question becomes, if you're defending Germany, which enemy feels more manageable? The one you can see, measure, predict, and fight? Or the one that turns the night into a lottery where you never know if the siren means death, or just another long, exhausting wait? Because in the next part, we're going straight into the numbers, and then into the nightmare that proved the RAF wasn't just bombing targets. They were learning how to burn cities themselves. And Hamburg is where it all snaps into focus. So let's talk about the part that doesn't care about feelings. The numbers. Because once you look at how German defenders could actually engage American raids versus British night raids, you understand why daylight felt like something Germany could wrestle with, and night felt like a slow, unavoidable collapse. Start with the American style. From 1943 into 1945, the U.S. sends big daylight formations, sometimes hundreds of heavy bombers at a time, flying high, often around the mid-20,000-foot range. They're built to stay together. That tight formation matters because it creates mutual defense and makes the raid act like one giant moving object in the sky. For German air defense, that's a problem, but it's a problem with a shape. Radar can pick it up. Controllers can estimate where it's headed. Fighters can be launched in a coordinated way. Flak commanders can prepare their batteries for the bomb run. When the Americans arrive, German pilots can see the bombers, choose an approach, and attack. It's violent, it's chaotic, and it's costly. Bombers go down, fighters go down. Sometimes the sky turns into a churn of metal and smoke. But from the German side, there's one key thing. They can measure what they're doing. They can count kills. They can adapt. They can plan. And sometimes they inflicted losses so heavy, the Americans had to rethink operations and tactics. Certain daylight raids became warning signs, proof that Germany could make the price too high if the Americans attacked the same way again. That's the core of daylight feels manageable. Not easy, manageable. Now look at the RAF at night. Instead of a single tight block of aircraft, the British often came as a stream, bombers spread out over time and space, not all arriving at once, not all at the same altitude, not all from the same direction. If you're a German night fighter pilot and you finally find one Lancaster closing in through darkness, you might get your shot and bring it down. But then what? You have to break off. You have to return, land, refuel, rearm, take off again, climb back into the dark, get guided again, and by the time you're ready to hunt, the raid might already be fading away into the night. So even on a good night, the defender's results are limited by time and visibility. It's not just skill, it's physics. The RAF system made it incredibly hard for Germany to pile up enough interceptions fast enough to stop the main blow. German night fighters could score, sure, but the overall stream kept flowing. And that creates a special kind of dread, the sense that even if you do everything right, the enemy still reaches the target. That's the word that matters: inevitability. With daylight raids, German commanders could tell themselves, if we hit them hard enough, they'll pause, they'll change, we can buy time. With the night campaign, the feeling was closer to, we can fight, we can bleed, and the bombs still fall anyway. Now add the second layer, the difference in what was being attacked. American daylight bombing focused heavily on war production, aircraft plants, oil and fuel systems, transportation networks, ball bearing production, shipyards, targets tied to the war machine. That doesn't mean civilians were safe. Daylight bombing killed civilians too, and misses happened. But the idea was that war production could be reduced and factories could be knocked out. From a civilian perspective, there's a grim logic there. You lose a workplace, a rail line, a plant. Terrible, but in many cases the city itself still stands. Repairs start. The next day, people try to continue. RAF night raids leaned harder into something else: area bombing, which could mean whole districts, whole neighborhoods, places where people lived, not just where they worked. And psychologically, that hits different. If a bomb wrecks an industrial site, you can tell yourself, that was the war. If your street is erased, your home is gone, your family is missing, your neighborhood is just ash, now the war has moved into your identity, your memories, your sense of normal life. That's why German civilians in places like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden often described the night as its own monster. Daylight was danger you could watch. Night was danger that swallowed everything. And when the RAF used incendiaries to create citywide fires, it wasn't just destruction. It was transformation. A city stops being a city and becomes a burning environment. Heat, smoke, wind, panic, and collapse all feeding each other. This is where Hamburg becomes the key example, not because it was the only place hit, but because it shows the RAF reaching for a specific result, not simply damage, but an overwhelming, self-sustaining inferno. In late July 1943, the RAF launches the raids that become known as Operation Gomorrah. The British planned these attacks with the goal of producing maximum fire spread. That meant selecting conditions that would favor widespread ignition and fast fire growth. The loadouts weren't just one type of weapon. They used combinations designed to open buildings, rupture infrastructure, and then start many fires quickly, fires that could merge. The raid system had a structure. A first wave goes in to hit and to overwhelm. Marker aircraft, pathfinders, help identify the target area so that the main force can concentrate its bombs where they will create the biggest effect. Then the main force arrives, large numbers of bombers delivering concentrated loads into a relatively tight area. And in Hamburg, the results were catastrophic. Fires multiply. One building becomes 10, 10 become 100. Streets become funnels of heat and smoke. Fire crews get overwhelmed, not because they lacked courage, but because there are too many simultaneous disasters. The danger isn't just flame, it's the environment the fire creates. Hot air rises and cooler air rushes in to replace it, increasing winds that feed the blaze. The stronger the fire gets, the more it pulls air in, and the more it sustains itself. Under the worst conditions, this becomes what survivors later recognized as a firestorm, an event with its own terrifying momentum. The human cost is enormous. The city's infrastructure breaks under pressure. Smoke and heat become lethal even away from direct flames. People who thought they were safe discover that the rules of survival have changed. And what makes it worse, mentally, is what comes next. Because the RAF doesn't treat it as a one-off. They return, multiple raids over a short period. The message to everyone on the ground is simple. This is not a single nightmare. It's a pattern you can't escape. Now, here's the contrast that German civilians noticed even when they hated both. The Americans bomb Hamburg too. In daylight, with different priorities, shipyards, industrial sites, port facilities, oil-related targets. And after those daylight hits, workers often show up and start repairs. The city battered still tries to function, but after the nights of concentrated fire, there are areas where repair isn't even the right word. What do you rebuild when the neighborhood is gone? Where do you go when the map in your head no longer matches the streets outside? That difference is why people could watch American bombers pass overhead in daylight and feel a sick kind of relief. Not because the Americans were harmless, because daylight felt predictable. And predictable is something human beings can cope with. Night, especially night that sometimes came, sometimes didn't, sometimes destroyed factories, sometimes erased homes. Night was a trap. And here's the twist. As brutal as terror is, it doesn't keep rising forever. After enough raids, people change. They harden. They go numb. They develop habits that look like courage from the outside, but are really survival instincts. By 1945, many German civilians weren't just scared of dying. They were scared of the sirens, the waiting, the hours underground. The question that never stops, is tonight the night? And in the next part, that's where we go. How the RAF made the waiting itself a weapon, how unpredictability cracked morale, and why even huge American raids didn't create the same kind of long-term dread. Because the British weren't only attacking cities, they were attacking the ability to feel normal at all. By the last years of the war, German fear wasn't always focused on the moment a bomb hit. It was focused on the hours before that, because terror changes shape when it becomes routine. The first big raid can break a city open. After enough raids, people don't just feel panic, they develop habits, dark humor, fatalism. A strange, we made it this far attitude. Life continues because it has to, but the fear doesn't disappear. It moves into the space between events, into the sound of the siren, into the dark ceiling of a shelter, into the guessing game that never ends. Is this real? Should we run? Is tonight the night? And this is where the RAF's approach did something the Americans didn't really do in the same way. The Americans, for all the destruction, were often predictable. Big formations, daylight, a more consistent pattern that German defenses could study. Civilians hated it, feared it, mourned it, but they could recognize it. The RAF made recognition harder. Bomber Command used tactics that disrupted the German sense of rhythm. Sometimes aircraft came in small numbers. Sometimes the sirens would sound and nothing would happen. Sometimes the disruption itself was the point, forcing people into shelters, stopping factory work, draining sleep, wrecking nerves, and then leaving them with hours of anxious waiting for nothing. One element of that was electronic and mechanical, not mystical, radar deception and jamming. The RAF began dropping strips of aluminum foil, what the British called window. The Germans called it duple. Those strips created false returns on German radar, cluttering screens so badly that real bomber tracks could be buried inside the noise. Now imagine being on the ground trying to defend a city. Your tools say the sky is full of threats, but you can't tell which blips matter. Searchlights sweep empty air, guns fire into darkness, fighters get vectored toward phantoms. And the sirens keep doing their job, pulling millions of people out of sleep and into underground rooms where time slows down. That's the key difference. With daylight raids, the fear spikes and then passes. With night raids, the fear stretches out. It becomes a long, grinding pressure. That pressure wore down workers too, not just because factories were hit, but because lives were repeatedly interrupted. Exhaustion became a strategic outcome. When a whole city can't sleep night after night, productivity suffers even if the machines are still standing. This is also why many German defenders used the language of helplessness when they described the night war later. Not helpless as in we didn't try, they absolutely tried, but helpless as in we couldn't ever be sure we were stopping it. And the Germans didn't lack for effort. They built and improved night fighters. They specialized crews. They refined ground control interception. They installed more radar. They adjusted searchlight belts. They deployed anti-aircraft guns in rings around cities. But the RAF kept adapting. If German controllers improved tracking, the RAF changed routes and altitudes. If night fighters started finding patterns, the RAF widened the stream, altered timing, used decoys, and poured on more radar confusion. It was a race where Germany kept sprinting and still felt like it was one step behind. That's what control really means here. Germany could sometimes control daylight battles. The incoming threat could be mapped. A plan could be made. A defense could be concentrated. A pilot could see his enemy and choose his moment. At night, control leaked away. And here's another piece people forget. The fear wasn't only on the ground. It was in the air, too, on both sides. German pilots who fought American bombers by day and British bombers by night often described daylight combat as brutal but understandable. You see the bombers, you see the escorts, you attack, you get attacked back. Night fighting was a different kind of stress. You're hunting shapes that barely exist. You're trusting instruments that can be fooled. You're following instructions that may be wrong because the screen is full of false targets. And even when you do everything right, the bomber stream keeps moving. Now flip the viewpoint, because if you think the civilians had it bad, the crews in those RAF bombers lived inside a nightmare machine. A Lancaster crew was typically 7 men with different jobs: pilot, navigator, bomb aimer, flight engineer, wireless operator, and gunners squeezed into tight positions. They flew for hours in the cold, in the dark, often with temperatures far below freezing at altitude, dealing with flak bursts they might not see until they're right in them, and fighters that could appear without warning. And the casualty rates were severe. RAF Bomber Command took losses so heavy that survival could feel like a coin flip stretched over repeated missions. Crews still went back up again and again because the campaign demanded it. That willingness, whether you call it courage, discipline, or something harder, was part of what German defenders found unsettling. It suggested the night offensive wasn't going to stop just because the cost was awful. A single night makes that point like a hammer. Nuremberg, March 1944. The RAF sends a major force toward Nuremberg and runs into a worst-case mix, conditions that helped German defenses see and intercept more effectively. German night fighters catch the bomber stream, and the result is disastrous for the RAF, one of Bomber Command's worst single-night losses, with many aircraft destroyed and crews killed or captured. If you're German leadership, that feels like a turning point. You'd think, we finally hit them hard enough. This has to slow the night campaign. But it didn't. The RAF continued operations. Different targets, different nights, same relentless return. And that's where German fear shifts from "these raids are deadly" to "these raids are permanent." Not permanent forever, nothing is, but permanent enough to shape how people live, sleep, work, and think. Daylight raids could be punished. Night raids could be endured, resisted, partially disrupted, but not reliably stopped. That difference matters even if the Americans were doing huge damage to the war economy, because Americans could be forced to adjust when losses got too high. They changed routes, tactics, formations, escort coverage, timing, pragmatic shifts in an evolving air war. They were determined, but their daylight system looked to German eyes like something that responded to pressure. The RAF night offensive looked like something that absorbed pressure and kept coming. And for civilians, that created a specific kind of dread. When you can see bombers overhead in sunlight, your brain can process it like a storm you can watch approach. When the enemy arrives unseen at night, after a week of sirens that may or may not mean death, your brain never gets to close the loop. You don't just fear the strike, you fear the uncertainty. That's why some German cities reported a strange emotional twist by the end. People feared the siren more than the explosion. The explosion ends. The siren begins the waiting. So if you boil this whole question down, why Germans feared RAF night bombers more than American daylight raids, even though American raids could be massive, it comes down to 2 things: predictability and control. The Americans were terrifying, but Germany could often analyze them, track them, engage them, measure results, tell itself a story about defense. The RAF at night attacked that story itself. They didn't just hit targets, they hit sleep, routine, nerves, and faith in protection. The Americans threatened the body of the war machine. The RAF threatened the mind of the nation, and in war, once people believe a threat can't be stopped, the fear goes deeper than the physical damage. If you made it to the end, hit the like button. Seriously, it tells YouTube to show you more WW2 stories like this one. So when German families chose what they feared most, many didn't name daylight formations they could see coming. They named the night, the sirens, the darkness, the engines they couldn't spot, the sense that nothing they did mattered. In daylight, you could at least watch danger approach. At night, you just listened for it, wondering if this time it was real and realizing that either way, tomorrow night would come again.